In the heart of London, near the Grand Buckingham Palace, the air buzzed with the excitement of tourists. Among them was Karen, a woman known for her bold nature, who was visiting from the United States. She and her friends wandered through the crowded plaza, cameras in hand, eager to capture every moment of their trip. The palace guards, famous for their ceremonial uniforms and unflinching discipline, stood at their posts, attracting the attention of everyone passing by. Karen, feeling particularly adventurous and spurred on by her friends' dares, joked about getting a reaction from one of these guards. "I bet you $20 I can make him move," she chuckled, pointing at a guard clad in a traditional red tunic and a tall, furry bearskin hat. Her friends laughed, egging her on, not believing she would actually dare to disturb the disciplined soldiers. As they approached the guard, Karen's demeanor shifted from playful to daring. Ignoring the small ropes and signs that cautioned tourists to keep a respectful distance, she stepped over the boundary. Her friends' laughter faded into the background as they watched, a mix of horror and curiosity painting their faces. Karen reached out quickly, her fingers grabbing at the bearskin hat. With a swift tug, she pulled it off, leaving the guard exposed and her friends in shock. The guard, trained to remain stoic, barely flinched, his eyes only slightly narrowing in displeasure and surprise. The area fell silent for a moment, the only sound being the soft thud of the hat hitting the ground. Unsatisfied with the lack of reaction, Karen threw the hat to the ground and stomped on it, her face turning into a smirk as she looked around at the stunned faces of the crowd. She expected laughter, cheers, or at least applause for her boldness. Instead, she found wide eyes and open mouths, many of the onlookers pulling out their phones, not to cheer, but to capture the disrespectful act she had just committed. The silence was soon filled with whispers and murmurs of disapproval. Karen, standing defiantly, felt a mix of pride and a creeping sense of worry as she realized the gravity of what she had just done. In her quest for a laugh and a memorable holiday stunt, she had crossed a line of respect and decorum. As she looked back at the guard, standing tall and composed, she began to understand the seriousness of her actions, with the royal guard's unwavering discipline stark against her rash impulsiveness. Karen's friends, who had initially egged her on with chuckles and nudges, now stood silent, their laughter turning into worried glances as they observed the unfolding drama. Karen, looking around, noticed that instead of the amused reaction she had anticipated, the crowd expressed a mixture of shock and disapproval. She caught glimpses of people shaking their heads, their faces twisted in discomfort and disdain. As she stood there, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The guard, whose hat she had just stomped on, maintained an impressive composure, his face barely betraying any emotion despite the breach of protocol. His stance remained firm, his eyes fixed forward, embodying the very essence of discipline and duty. Karen could feel the weight of his silent judgment, and it was far more intense than any words he might have spoken. The atmosphere around them thickened with tension. Tourists whispered among themselves, and the clicking of camera shutters filled the air as more and more people started recording the incident. Karen's attempt to incite a humorous reaction had turned into a public spectacle, spotlighting her disrespect for the traditions and duties of the royal guards. Amidst the murmurs and the occasional gasp from the crowd, the distinct sound of footsteps approached. Additional guards, along with a couple of security personnel, began to converge on the scene. Their approach was calm but assertive, their faces stern, signaling the seriousness with which they viewed the violation of their colleagues' dignity. One of the senior guards, a tall figure with years of service visible in his poised demeanor, stepped forward. He addressed Karen directly, his voice firm but controlled. "Madam, this behavior is unacceptable. You must step back and return the hat immediately." His British accent, authoritative and unwavering, cut through the noise of the crowd, demanding compliance. Karen, her initial bravado fading into unease, complied. She picked up the hat, now dirtied and misshapen from her actions, and handed it back to the guard. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it, her eyes darting around at the many cameras still focused on her. She mumbled an apology, her voice barely audible over the hum of whispered judgments and continued shutter clicks. The senior guard took the hat with a nod, his expression unchanging. "Thank you for complying. Please remain here. The authorities have been notified," he informed her, signaling to the security personnel to stay close. Karen's heart sank as the reality of potential legal consequences began to dawn on her. What started as a dare had escalated into a serious incident, casting a dark shadow over what was supposed to be a fun day out with friends. As the guard resumed his position, the damaged hat no longer on his head, the crowd slowly began to disperse, their curiosity satisfied but their opinions of Karen clearly dimmed. The remaining whispers were tinged with criticism, and Karen stood there, a stark figure of regret, awaiting the arrival of the authorities who would decide her fate. Karen stood frozen, her heart pounding as the weight of her actions pressed down on her. What had started as a playful dare had quickly spiraled into something far more serious. The whispers of the crowd hadn't stopped. In fact, they seemed to grow louder, and more people were pointing at her, shaking their heads in disbelief. Her friends, who had once encouraged her antics, now distanced themselves slightly, as if hoping to avoid getting involved. Karen glanced at them, silently pleading for support, but they looked away, pretending to be mere spectators rather than accomplices in her reckless stunt. She felt a lump in her throat as the realization hit her. She was on her own now. The royal guard she had humiliated remained composed, standing in his usual stiff posture, but there was something different now. Though his face showed no expression, Karen could feel the weight of his silent judgment. He wasn't just any regular worker. He was a symbol of duty and tradition, someone who had trained for years to stand in that very position. And she had insulted that honor. The sound of approaching boots echoed across the courtyard. Karen turned to see two uniformed security officers walking toward her with steady, purposeful strides. They weren't running or shouting, but their presence alone was enough to make her stomach twist with nervousness. "Miss," one of the officers spoke, his voice firm but calm. "You need to come with us." Karen swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "Look, it was just a joke," she said, forcing a weak smile. "I didn't mean any harm." The officer didn't react to her explanation. His gaze remained steady. "Tampering with a member of the Royal Guard is a serious offense. Please cooperate." Karen's throat went dry. A serious offense. She had assumed she might get a warning, maybe a fine at most. But the way the officer spoke made it clear that this wasn't something she could walk away from easily. She hesitated, glancing at her friends once more, but they avoided eye contact, shifting uncomfortably. They weren't going to defend her. They weren't going to argue on her behalf. This was all on her. The crowd had mostly stopped recording, but she could still feel their stares burning into her. Some people looked satisfied, as if they believed justice was being served. Others simply watched in fascination, waiting to see what would happen next. Karen exhaled sharply and nodded. "Fine," she muttered. "I'll go." The officer gestured for her to walk ahead, and she did, her steps slow and heavy. As she moved, the reality of her actions fully settled in. She had thought she could get away with a harmless prank, but now she was facing real consequences. As she was led away from the courtyard, Karen couldn't shake the sinking feeling in her chest. She had made a terrible mistake, and now she was about to find out just how serious the consequences would be. Karen walked with heavy steps, her heart pounding in her chest as the security officers led her away from the courtyard. The whispers of the crowd faded behind her, but she could still feel the weight of their judgment. This was not how she had imagined her day would go. She had thought it would be a funny story to tell later, a harmless prank to get some laughs. Instead, she was now being escorted like a troublemaker, her stomach twisting with regret. The officers remained silent as they guided her toward a small building near the palace gates. It wasn't a jail, but it was definitely an official security post. Karen's hands felt clammy as she stepped inside, her mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. Would they fine her? Give her a warning. Could she really be arrested for something as simple as pulling a hat off someone's head? One of the officers finally spoke. "Have a seat," he instructed, gesturing toward a chair in the corner of the room. Karen sat down, feeling a mix of nervousness and frustration. She hadn't expected things to escalate this far. The second officer stood near the doorway, speaking into a radio. "We have the individual in custody, awaiting further instructions." Custody. The word made Karen's heart sink further. She hadn't thought of herself as a criminal, but the way they were treating her made her realize just how serious this was. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. Karen fidgeted in her seat, her hands gripping the edges of the chair. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but she knew arguing wouldn't help. Instead, she let out a deep sigh and lowered her gaze, wishing she could rewind time and take back what she had done. The door opened again, and another man in a dark uniform entered. He was older, with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through her. He carried a folder in one hand and a serious expression on his face. "Miss, do you understand what you have done?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Karen hesitated before nodding. "It was just a joke," she muttered. "I didn't mean any harm." The man raised an eyebrow. "A joke?" He shook his head. "You interfered with a royal guard during his duty. That is considered a breach of public order and could lead to legal consequences." Karen swallowed hard. She had expected a slap on the wrist, not actual legal trouble. The officer continued, "These guards are not just for show. They are trained professionals serving an important role. Tampering with them is not taken lightly." Karen felt her face flush with shame. She had seen the guards as statues, something for entertainment rather than real people with real responsibilities. The officer sighed, flipping through the pages in the folder. "For now, we are processing the incident. Depending on the decision, you may face a fine or additional penalties." Karen's stomach twisted. A fine? How much? And what did additional penalties mean? She sat silently, her mind spinning as she realized she had no control over what happened next. Karen sat in the small security office, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair as the weight of her situation became heavier. She had never imagined that pulling a hat off a guard would lead to this. She had thought it would be funny, something to joke about later. But now, with security officers watching her closely and an official flipping through reports, it was clear this was no joke. The officer who had spoken earlier glanced up from the folder. "You're lucky," he said, his voice calm but firm. "In some cases, behavior like this could lead to an arrest. Interfering with a royal guard is a serious offense." He let the words hang in the air, watching as Karen swallowed hard. Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her voice quieter now, lacking the confidence she had earlier. The officer set down the folder and leaned forward slightly. "That depends on how cooperative you are," he said. "You're going to need to take responsibility for your actions. That includes accepting a formal warning and possibly a fine." Karen let out a shaky breath. A fine was bad, but it was better than getting arrested. "Okay," she nodded. "I understand." The officer continued, "You'll also be required to issue an official apology, both to the guard and to the authorities." His gaze didn't waver. "This isn't just about a piece of clothing. These guards represent an important institution, and their discipline is taken seriously." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had never thought about it that way. To her, the guards had seemed like a tourist attraction, something people took pictures with, not actual professionals serving an important role. One of the security officers moved to a desk and began filling out a form. Karen sat in silence, feeling the minutes drag by. Every so often, she could hear voices outside. Tourists still exploring the palace grounds, unaware of the trouble she had gotten herself into. Finally, the officer handed her a document. "You need to sign this," he said. "It acknowledges that you understand what you did, accept the consequences, and will not repeat this behavior." Karen took the paper, her hands slightly trembling. As she read through it, she realized just how serious this situation had been. The document listed the fine she would have to pay, several £100s, and a formal note that her name would be registered in the local records for public misconduct. It wasn't a criminal record, but it was enough to serve as a warning. She picked up the pen and signed her name, exhaling as she set it back down. The officer took the paper and nodded. "You're free to go," he said, "but I suggest you take this as a lesson. The next time you visit another country, show respect for its traditions." Karen stood up, her legs feeling stiff. She nodded, mumbling another quiet, "I understand," before heading toward the door. As she stepped outside, the bright sunlight hit her face, but the weight of embarrassment still clung to her. She had come to London for an adventure, but she was leaving with an unforgettable lesson instead. As Karen walked out of the security office, she could still feel the eyes of the tourists around her, some curious, others judgmental. Her friends, who had been with her earlier, had left the scene when the authorities got involved, making her feel even more isolated. She was now alone with her thoughts, her mind racing as she tried to understand what had just happened. She walked slowly, the light from the late afternoon sun almost blinding after the dull lighting of the small office. She was still processing everything: the fine, the apology, the possible impact on her record. And she couldn't shake the feeling of regret. Her steps were heavy, and as she passed the long line of people waiting to see the changing of the guard, it hit her just how much of a spectacle she had caused. The royal guard stood tall in the distance, looking dignified and calm, and Karen felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. Why had she thought it was funny? She wondered. The guard had simply been doing his job, something that had been passed down through generations. Yet Karen had treated it like a game. Now, with the fine and the formal apology ahead of her, she realized the depth of her mistake. Her mind wandered back to the conversation in the security office. The officer had made it clear that her actions hadn't just been disrespectful. They had undermined something much bigger than her. The royal guard wasn't just a soldier standing still. He was a symbol of tradition and service. That had never crossed her mind before, and she now understood why the situation had escalated the way it did. As Karen walked back through the plaza toward her hotel, she couldn't help but replay the moment in her head. The way the guard had stared straight ahead, unblinking, unmoving, while she stood there with the stolen hat in her hands. She had expected some kind of reaction, maybe a shout, a reprimand, or even a chase. But instead, he had remained perfectly still. His silence had spoken louder than any words. She found herself wishing she could go back and undo it all. But she knew it wasn't that simple. Her actions had consequences, and even though she hadn't intended to make things so serious, she had to face them now. As she entered the hotel, she received a few glances from the staff at the front desk. They were polite but distant, as if they knew something she didn't. She felt like everyone was watching her, even though she knew it was just her own guilty conscience playing tricks on her. When she reached her room, Karen sank down onto the bed, exhausted. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her social media feed, hoping to find some distraction. But instead, she was met with a flood of notifications. The video of her stunt had already gone viral. The images of her pulling the hat off the royal guard, followed by her stomping on it, were all over the internet. There were memes, jokes, and countless comments, many of them mocking her. Some were supportive, but most were critical. Karen stared at the screen for a long time, unsure of how to feel. She had become a laughingstock overnight. She wanted to delete everything, to forget the whole incident, but deep down, she knew it was too late for that. The damage had been done, and now she had to face the consequences, not just from the authorities but from the public as well. Her phone buzzed again with a text message from one of her friends. "Hey, saw what happened. You okay?" The message was short, but it stung. Karen wasn't sure what to say. She had made a fool of herself, and no text could fix that. She set the phone down and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. She had learned a hard lesson today, one that she would never forget. And though she didn't know what the future held, she knew this experience would change the way she viewed the world and the importance of respecting traditions and people, no matter where she was. The next few days in London were a blur for Karen. Her thoughts remained tangled in the events that had unfolded since the incident with the Royal Guard. She spent most of her time in her hotel room, scrolling through social media, trying to see if the storm had died down yet. But it hadn't. The video of her mishap had gone viral, with people all over the world sharing their opinions. Some were still mocking her, others were calling for her to be banned from the UK, and a few were even saying she should be banned from traveling entirely. The weight of the judgment felt suffocating. Her friends had tried to reach out, but their texts felt distant, almost uncomfortable. They hadn't spoken to her about the incident directly, but she could tell they were unsure how to approach it. One of her friends, Rachel, messaged her, "I'm sorry, Karen. I know you didn't mean for it to go like that." The message was kind, but Karen could tell it wasn't filled with the same enthusiasm as before. It stung, even though she knew Rachel was just trying to be supportive. On the day after the incident, Karen reluctantly returned to the location where it all began, the place where the Royal Guard stood his post. The area was still crowded with tourists, and the guards were still standing tall, their stoic faces remaining as unmoved as ever. She couldn't help but feel a knot in her stomach as she walked past the guards, their presence now reminding her of how she had disrespected the very thing they represented. It was hard not to feel like everyone who saw her was judging her. As Karen wandered through the crowds, she found herself standing near the same spot where she had taken the guard's hat. A few tourists glanced at her, recognizing her face from the viral video. She quickly looked away, trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone. She felt the sting of embarrassment, the knowledge that she would forever be remembered for something so foolish. She tried to focus on the scenery, but it was hard. She felt out of place, like she no longer belonged in the same space as the other visitors who were simply enjoying their time. It wasn't just the tourists around her. It was the weight of the lesson she had learned, the understanding that her actions had consequences far beyond what she could have imagined. That afternoon, she decided to take a walk through a nearby park to clear her mind. The calmness of the park, with its green trees and peaceful paths, helped soothe her racing thoughts. She sat on a bench, watching families and couples walk by, and for the first time in days, she took a deep breath and felt a sense of relief. The world hadn't ended, and while her mistake had been huge, it wasn't the end of everything. Karen knew she would have to face the consequences of her actions. She couldn't undo what she had done, but she could learn from it. She had learned about respect for tradition, about the importance of understanding the roles that people play in society, and most of all, she had learned about humility. This wasn't something she had expected to learn on her trip to London, but now, it was a lesson that would stay with her forever. The next day, Karen made a call to the local authorities as part of the process of following up on her fine and formal apology. She felt a nervous flutter in her chest as she dialed the number. But this time, she wasn't afraid to face what was coming. She knew she had made a mistake, and now it was time to own up to it. After the call, she sat back on her bed and thought about what had happened. The embarrassment was still there, but it was slowly being replaced with a sense of understanding. Karen wasn't the same person she had been before the incident. The events had changed her, made her more aware of the world around her, and taught her that even small actions can have big consequences. She wasn't sure how long it would take for things to blow over, or when she would stop feeling like people were judging her, but she knew she could move forward, one step at a time. As the days passed, Karen's life began to settle into a new routine. London, once a city full of excitement and adventure, now felt different. She had learned her lesson in a way she never expected, and although the embarrassment still lingered, she was gradually coming to terms with it. Her friends, though distant at first, had reached out more in the past few days. They apologized for not supporting her immediately after the incident and admitted they hadn't fully understood the gravity of what had happened. Karen was grateful for their understanding, but the feeling of isolation still weighed heavily on her. One afternoon, she decided to take a walk around the city. She had been cooped up in her hotel room long enough, and a change of scenery might help lift her spirits. The streets were busy, full of people going about their lives, tourists snapping photos, and locals walking in a hurry to get to work. Karen felt like a small part of this vast, bustling world, just another face in the crowd. As she walked, her thoughts wandered back to the Royal Guard incident. She couldn't erase the memory of how her actions had made a mockery of something so important to others. She had been caught up in the moment, desperate to make her friends laugh, but at the cost of respect. She had no idea the impact it would have, but now she understood the value of showing reverence to the traditions of other cultures. Karen stopped by a cafe to grab a coffee, trying to distract herself from her thoughts. She sat by the window, staring out at the busy street. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, calming her nerves a bit. She took a sip, reflecting on how different things had been just a week ago. She had come to London with such excitement, hoping for new experiences and stories to tell. But now, she realized that the most important story she had gained was the one about personal growth. It wasn't just about learning from her mistake. It was about embracing responsibility and understanding that actions have consequences, sometimes far beyond what we initially realize. She had made a foolish mistake, but that mistake didn't define her. How she responded to it, how she learned from it, would shape the person she became. The thought of returning home to the States had crossed her mind, but she wasn't ready to leave London yet. She needed time to process everything, to understand the lessons she had learned, and to give herself the space to move forward without feeling ashamed. Karen made a decision. She would finish her trip, not with the weight of her past mistake, but with the knowledge that she had grown from it. That evening, after a quiet dinner, she walked back to her hotel, taking the long route along the River Thames. The city was lit up beautifully, and as Karen walked along the water's edge, she began to feel a sense of peace that had been missing for days. The incident with the Royal Guard was no longer the focus of her thoughts. Instead, she thought about the people she had met, the experiences she had gained, and the quiet lessons that life had taught her in a way she had never expected. When she returned to her room, she found another message from her friend Rachel. This time, it was simple but heartfelt. "I'm glad you're okay. Let's catch up when you get home." Karen smiled and typed back a reply. "I'd like that. I've got a lot to share with you." She sat back on the bed, her phone in hand, feeling a sense of relief. She knew she wasn't the same person who had walked into London with excitement and curiosity. She had learned so much more than she had planned to. And though it had been a tough journey, it was one that would leave her stronger, wiser, and more aware of the world around her. The city outside her window seemed to glow with possibility, and for the first time in days, Karen felt ready to face whatever came next.